Hi guys, welcome or welcome back. If you don't know me, I'm Anna. I'm a psychologist in training. This channel is all about real life applications to psychology. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. Today we're talking about 7 types of trauma reactions. Before we get into this, I just want to clarify, typically when people experience a traumatic incident, they have a wide range of symptoms, kind of like a constellation of symptoms, if you will. And so I in no way want to suggest that people just have one typical reaction to trauma. But I do think there are some people who tend to have one type of reaction to trauma that they tend to lean more towards, kind of like a trauma profile, if you will, a tendency that they have and how they tend to respond to trauma. Sorry, I'm trying to get comfortable. I'm filming in the old location, which is in the bathroom, because I'm currently moving everything out, preparing to move across the country, so be patient with me. So when it comes to trauma, every reaction to trauma is an attempt at self-preservation. Sometimes and often those attempts turn maladaptive. They go a little bit too far. They start to interfere with your life or cause you distress. But initially it's intended to keep you safe from future trauma or to help you manage what happened, and it just kind of goes overboard, and that's when you would have a trauma disorder from the DSM. So keep this in mind, because I'm going to be talking about why all of the reactions that I'll be listing tend to have an adaptive function. They exist for a reason. If you've experienced a trauma, they're there to protect you. So one common reaction to trauma is emotional dysregulation, and this can look like disorders like cluster B personality disorder, such as borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. It can look like complex PTSD. It's honestly very, very similar to borderline personality disorder in its appearance. It's very rare to get a case of BPD that isn't associated with some form of early trauma. Like, yes, I'm sure that there are people out there who have BPD who have not experienced a trauma whatsoever. Like, there are definitely genetic temperamental predispositions for it, but it's also very, very important to assess whether there were some situational traumatic events that could have triggered this or worsened this personality. And so for me, when I hear about BPD versus CPTSD, yes, they're different constructs. CPTSD is not actually an official diagnosis yet in the US. In other places it is, but they look very similar, and often they're both born from trauma. And emotional dysregulation is a core feature of that for both of them. So people who respond to trauma with emotional dysregulation might take part in things like self-destruction, self-harm, fear of abandonment, dramatic or erratic behavior, SI. It could be things like compulsive purchases, unsafe driving, disordered eating, sexually risky behaviors, emotional outbursts. I also think emotional dysregulation can kind of be framed as a form of adult enactment. So children who go through traumas will often act them out. They will replay what's happening through things like play therapy or art therapy. And it's not so much a re-experiencing like we hear with like war vets who tend to be male, experience more nightmares and flashbacks, but rather acting it out. And I think for adults who are emotionally dysregulated, who tend to take parts in those behaviors that are re-traumatizing, I also can see that being a form of enactment, a form of reacting to your trauma by trying to do it over, to do it right this time. Often people who respond to trauma through emotional dysregulation are the imperfect victims when it comes to abuse. These are the people that are less likely to be taken seriously because they're seen as theatrical, dramatic, fake. They're very easily to dismiss because people think that they're an unreliable source, and it's much easier to simply blame the person who's dysregulated than to think about why are they dysregulated in the first place. Is it really a disorder if it's caused by trauma? There is no normal reaction to something that is inherently very abnormal, which is something very bad happening to you. Either way, people who tend to respond to trauma through emotional dysregulation, it tends to be more permanent in their personality the earlier on the trauma occurred. So for example, something traumatic happens when you're 3 years old, it can definitely turn into a personality disorder, versus if something happens when you're 26, you can definitely experience some emotional dysregulation, but it's not necessarily going to turn into like a personality disorder. Because your personality by that age is pretty stable, there's no way of developing a personality disorder once you're fully formed. A second way that people respond to trauma is through dissociation. So when I talk about dissociation, I know this word gets used a lot colloquially. I'm not talking about just like zoning out, daydreaming. That can be like a low-level form of dissociation. but I'm specifically talking about things like depersonalization, derealization, out-of-body experiences, and dissociative identity disorder. Depersonalization is when you don't feel like yourself. Maybe you don't recognize yourself, you just feel like you're kind of a stranger in your own body. Realization is when you don't feel like the world around you is real, something just feels kind of surreal, something feels not safe, something feels strange around you. An out-of-body experience is something like what Ernest Hemingway described when he almost got killed in war and he literally felt himself leave his body. And some people can actually see their physical form down there below them while they're soaring up here. And then dissociative identity disorder is what was previously known as multiple personality disorder, kind of self-explanatory. This is when people have multiple personas within them, and this has also been associated with trauma. But I think dissociation is not just linked to these disorders or these symptoms of disorders. It's also linked to things like wanting to push away what happened. That's what dissociation essentially is. It's like, this is so painful, I can't be in my body, I can't be here right now, I'm literally going to leave my body and go somewhere else or become someone else. And along the same lines are things like really heavily using defense mechanisms such as denial and repression. So I think for people who tend to dissociate, tend to push away the trauma, they also use these defense mechanisms very much. Basically, people whose trauma reactions lean towards dissociation tend to avoid triggers or reminders or thinking about the trauma because their mind can't handle it right now or thinks it can't handle it right now and wants to protect them. Again, it's a protective mechanism. I think this is also how a lot of stoic and resilient people deal with trauma. They kind of deny its impact, detach from it, move on with their lives without really acknowledging it. I know people from a lot of different cultures have this attitude, and I'm thinking about my own culture, you know, Romanian people. Does that make it wrong per se? Again, I really want to stress that there is no normal reaction to the abnormal experience of having to go through a traumatic event. However, there is a psychological risk to this, which leads to my next point, which is re-experiencing is a third trauma reaction. So again, I'm talking about things like nightmares, flashbacks, constantly thinking about what's happening. Ironically, when you push away something, when you dissociate from something, you're risking your mind trying to remind you about it without your consent. I've used this metaphor before, it's from ACT, but imagine that you have a beach ball. If you push the beach ball underwater, does it stay there? No, it just comes up harder. The harder you push it down, the harder it comes up. It's kind of the same with trauma. The harder you push it down, the harder it'll fight to remind you that it's there. Re-experiencing tends to be more common in men than in women, and in adults than in kids. It's kind of the mind's way of making sense of something very confusing and emotionally powerful, of trying to fix or figure out the situation. So for example, when my grandpa died a few years ago, I was having so many dreams about it. And I know this is really common with people when they experience a loss. They have so many dreams about the event because their mind is trying to make sense of it. Another trauma reaction can be summarized in the words anxiety, paranoia, and hypervigilance. Emotions that are high arousal and low valence. What I mean by that is physiologically you feel very heightened, you feel aroused, you feel your heart racing, your blood pulsing, you feel very wired and restless. But low valence means it doesn't feel good. It's not like excitement or joy, which would be high arousal, high valence. It's high arousal, low valence. You're not feeling good. So this could include anxiety disorders, paranoid personality disorder, simply feeling jumpy or on edge. This is not an uncommon way that people respond to trauma reactions. So again, why is this one adaptive to experience after a trauma? The mind wants to protect you by avoiding future traumas. It's essentially trying to say, I don't know if you can trust that person's neutral expression on the street. I can't be sure if you can go around that corner safely. I want to ensure that what happened in the past doesn't happen again. And in that way, it's overprotecting you and it's keeping you really, really tightly wound to the point where you're experiencing a lot of anxiety and paranoia. Then there's depression. So whereas anxiety was high arousal, low valence, depression is low arousal, low valence. So this is when you're physiologically feeling low and your mood is also low. I don't know why I'm explaining this. You all know what depression is. But sometimes the pain of the trauma is so powerful, it's just easier for the mind to numb all emotions and go to a low place where it doesn't have to really bother itself with that. At least low is on the ground. At least low isn't flying 30,000 feet in the air due to anxiety, emotional dysregulation, or dissociation. For people whose go-to response to trauma is depression, their low mood is basically also an attempt at self-preservation. So these people might experience low energy, fatigue, low motivation, just want to rest in bed, trying desperately to find something to make them feel a little bit of happiness, even if it's just a tasty snack or a Netflix show that they can half focus on. Then another reaction to trauma is becoming the abuser. When someone is being abused, specifically when we're talking about that type of trauma, they may resort to identifying with the person harming them because they can't handle the powerlessness associated with the knowledge that they're the victim. So they might unconsciously say to themselves, well, screw this, I'm done being the victim here, I'm gonna be the bad guy, and then no one will be able to hurt me. So then you might run into things like narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, also called psychopathy, sadistic personality disorder, or just no disorder and just generally mistreating people and harming them. This is why so many CSA victims then go on to be perpetrators. Well, it's part of the reason. I think part of the reason is that they've had something happen to them and they want to make sure that it never happens again. And so they associate themselves with the person doing the harm and they go on to replicate the cycle. And again, this is one of those situations where the earlier on it happens in someone's life, the more permanent it is in their personality. And the last trauma reaction that I have never heard talked about, honestly, is that there's no reaction. There's no psychopathology. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that sometimes people react to a very significant trauma by not developing any symptoms because of it. Trauma affects everyone differently, and different types of trauma affect different people differently too. So for example, I've had clients who told me horrific instances of trauma that they were seemingly unaffected by, but then they had other experiences of trauma that maybe to me would have seemed less severe, that to them were devastating. Like I said, there is no normal reaction to an abnormal experience such as trauma. So even this is normal. And these people are lucky in life because something about their brain and possibly their attitude protects them from the trauma reactions that are meant to protect other people but tend to go overboard. So for example, I think I've mentioned this story before, but my grandma has the sweetest cat. And at some point last year, we think somebody beat him because he came home very heavily injured. She got him so many surgeries. He's really happy. He's healthy now. So it's all good. But when he came back from the surgery, he was still not afraid of people. He was still very friendly, very affectionate. And it was a little strange because in my head, it was like, well, how can we know he's safe if he goes and walks up to the person that hurts him again? Like, how are we going to know that he's able to protect himself? So in a sense, maybe it isn't completely adaptive to react with no reaction, but it's also not wrong. And honestly, these people are very blessed for not reacting very poorly to trauma. Because like I've been talking about, a lot of these trauma reactions, they're there to protect you, but they sometimes go overboard. And that's where psychopathology emerges. So those were 7 possible reactions to trauma that people adopt. If you feel comfortable and you've experienced a trauma, I'm curious to hear which of these patterns you most relate to, but please do not share more than you feel comfortable sharing, and always look after yourself. I know this is a heavy topic, and as always, I really encourage you to seek therapy if this is something that you related to. And I'll also put some resources down below for if this has been very triggering for you and you need to talk to someone. But I hope that's not the case. I hope this video was helpful. I'll talk to you in a few days and hope you have a great rest of your week.